Our final presenter for today is Dr. Gary Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is a professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery at the University of Arizona and director of its Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. He is also director of development of energy healing at Canyon Ranch. His research integrates mind-body medicine, energy medicine, and spiritual medicine. He has published more than 450 scientific papers, co-edited 11 academic books, and is the author of many books including The Sacred Promise, How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives. Please welcome Dr. Gary Schwartz.
Microphone working here? Does anybody know? I think it is. Better. Do you mind if I sit? Who said yes? Good job. It's very fortuitous that there was a panel before this apparently last presentation. And I want to thank Dr. Doi for conveniently arranging this so that I could sit down. These seats aren't the most comfortable for my back. I'm not sure if they're comfortable for yours. And this is delightful. But it's also special for me because we have three more seats up here. And I'm reserving these seats possibly for others who might join us. And I'm going to try to make this the comments about this be more real. And what I mean by be more real is take the deep significance of the meaning of Spiritism with the idea that, quote, the greater reality is right here. That literally we say here and there, but the word there has the word here in it. And so therefore, just like we said that maybe Dr. Candace Pert could have been here yesterday, that many others could be here as well, and that what's going to transform is the more active collaboration between here and there. This is an interesting title, Acknowledging the Spirit, a Turning Point in Research. That is not my title. That was Dr. Toy's title. And when I thought about Dr. Toy and why she picked this title, I realized that there was a curious synchronicity here. Because there was an aspect of the work that I've been doing that directly related to that title, and it gave me an excuse to share it with you and then honor the greater premise of this work. So here we go. We heard yesterday the comment that Candace was greater than life in this life, or bigger than life in this life. And what I've observed in the years of research that I've been doing this work is that people who are bigger than life in this life tend to be bigger than life in the next. And this was certainly the case with two of these individuals here. The person on the bottom is Susie Smith, who I've written about in a number of books, and certainly in those first two. And also the person who's above him is William James. And as many of you know, he was essentially a father of psychology in America, was deeply interested in this kind of work. He became very involved with Susie Smith, although he had been deceased apparently for at least 50 years before Susie ended up being connected with him. And then apparently he became involved in our work as a result of me meeting Susie. And one of the things that it's so obvious that I, for one, have taken it for granted, is that the reason why mediums can receive the energy and information from those who have transitioned, and the reason why sitters can recognize their loved ones, is because there is a continuity of personality. There's a continuity of history. And it's not that people can't change and grow after they've transitioned, because they do. And it's not that they can't appear in different, let's say, stages of their life, because they can. But the fact is that people are recognizable, and there are aspects of this life that they're now in the next life, which is very much a part of who they are. And these individual differences persist. And not only is that fortuitous, it's not fortuitous for us who miss our loved ones, and for them, because they can be recognized, but it also makes it meaningful for having a life in the first place. I mean, if you're going to develop specific loves, you're going to develop specific relationships, you want to be able to know and be able to honor and celebrate and appreciate those relationships that we had before. And this point is so obvious. It came through so clearly in our earliest research when we would have people rate the readings in terms of, for example, recognizing the personality of their loved ones. Those ratings were among the highest ratings in terms of accuracy. So yes, you can identify specific names, specific initials, specific historical facts, and so on. But there were descriptions of personality, these more vaguer concepts, people's energy, their style. And you knew it was your son, you knew it was your daughter, you knew it was your sister. And we never formally did any research in that area. But individual differences started showing up, not just in our mediumship research, but in our technology research. And that's what I want to talk about here. You'll recall that I shared with you this part of the theory that led me to be open to all of this from what I learned about the nature of light, and we talked about how we can see starlight with the naked eye, particularly where we're away from the city lights and there's no moon and there's no clouds and so on, but during the day we can't see all of that starlight. And the reason that we can't see it is not because it's not there, but because we're blinded of the brightness of the light and the energy in our vicinity. And I gave you the take-home message that sometimes we need to go into the dark in order to see the light. Well, when we began doing research on seeing whether we could detect the energy of spirit, for example, the visible light that might be emitted or reflected by spirit, it was in part based on that premise that there was more to see than, and even with our native senses. And we began doing research with various individuals using a device called the silicon photomultiplier system. This is a piece of technology. It's become available in the past, I'd say, 5 years. It detects single photons of light in a pitch black environment. It's cooled to minus 22 degrees centigrade. A single system like this, which is only 1.5 inches cubed, costs about $2,500. It's not inexpensive from a personal point of view, but not terribly expensive from a scientific point of view. This technology is used for the building of medical imaging kinds of devices, and the software that runs this is not user-friendly, but you can use it in a research purpose. And what we decided to do was to put it within a box within a box within a box, making a completely dark environment, and then inviting specific spirits. We sometimes refer to them as our departed hypothesized co-investigators, to enter the box and to see whether or not it could detect their photons and or if they could learn to produce photons. And the very first set of experiments, which are these data, I'll share with you very briefly, because this is not the primary point. The primary point is going to be the individual differences in all of this. We would have a series of trials. Here, this is number of photon bursts in a 30-second period. We would have baseline trials interspersed with spirit intention trials. In this case, there were 20 of them. So this is a very stable estimate of what's called the dark noise, the quote, background noise with signals that the equipment is picking up. And when we invited various spirits to go into the box, on the average, you could see that there was a clearly measurable increase, and this was also clearly statistically significant. Now, of course, one of the immediate questions that then gets raised is, well, how do we know that this is not the mind of the experimenter? Because the mind of the experiment is always taking place here, inviting spirit to go into the chamber. So we did an experiment. So we collected another set of baseline data here, so you can see it's slightly different than this. And then we asked the experimenter, who, by the way, was skilled in meditation, to try to put his mind in the box and see if he could do what happened when he invited spirit. And you can see how successful he was. And not at all. We then ran a third set of trials. And we, here's the baseline trials again, a new set of baseline trials. And then we asked spirit to leave the laboratory altogether, just to see what the baseline would look like. And if anything, it went down in the opposite down, but it was not statistically significant. This was the basic set of experiments. Well, scientists are very conservative people, and of course, what you want to do, you want to replicate. You want to replicate and extend. So, and I noticed, we'll be running these subjects, that some of these spirits seem to produce larger effects than others. So here's a second experiment. This is where a set of baseline data using even more stringent recording conditions. And this is a spirit that we'll call Sophia. I'm not going to identify anything more about these spirits right now, or at least this person. And you'll notice that when she was in the chamber, there was essentially a 200% increase. It doubled the number of photons when she was in the chamber. And these are many trials compared to the control. Here's another person who produced a 200% increase. There's the baseline trials, and there's the spirit intention trials. This was spirit number 2, and who was Sophia, and this is spirit number 5. And we'll keep the identity private for a while. I then did a third experiment. I don't think I have that one here on the slide. With spirit number 5, because he seemed to be so good at this that I then invited him to see whether we could potentially turn this into a spirit communication technology. So I asked him if he could, since he was used to working with this equipment, if he could make a yes response versus making a no response, that is, create a pattern. And I would let him pick this out, so we would just have baseline trials, yes trials, and no trials. I should also share with you that we gave him a lot of opportunity to practice. We let the equipment run for hours and hours, and on a large screen monitor, they could see the photons occurring on a moment-to-moment basis. So they could learn what they were doing, like biofeedback, or like learning any skill to practice what they were doing. And what we observed was that, sure enough, there were increased photons when they were in the box compared to not within the box. But more importantly, there was a pattern difference. And that is that when the yes response,
the other microphone so we can hear better.
Ah. Not yet? Now? You can hear me? Excellent. Okay. Anyway, the yes pattern was still different than the no pattern. What we discovered is that for the yes pattern, spirit number 5 would produce increased photons toward the beginning of a trial, and during the no trials, he would produce the photons toward the end of the trial. So you could clearly distinguish yes or no. These data were submitted to a journal, and it went through peer review. In fact, it's the journal Explorer, and they even have blind peer review. So the author's name that write the paper is not on it, and so therefore the reviewers who do this are blind to the identity of the experimenters. And it ultimately passed muster and was published. However, the reviewers had one primary concern, which we're going to get back to, is how do we know that somehow this isn't connected to the energy or the mind of the experimenter who's running this equipment? And we'll get there momentarily. But I want to share with you one other piece of data here, because we're going to be talking about individual difference. That's the focus. And this is spirit number 5, who I said seemed to be like a superstar. And one of the things I discovered with this particular person is that not only could he produce bursts or not bursts, but he could affect the amplitude of the bursts. And so in one creative moment, and this is part of a paper that's being submitted for publication, I asked him if he could, within a 300, I'm trying to remember how long this trial period was. I think it was short of it. It's not important right now. Within a given trial length, whether he could produce a normal-sized burst, a big burst, or a really large burst. And so you can see this was the maximum photon burst, or sum, which is a burst, within a I guess it was 350, well, that's amplitude. But you can see the amplitude was about 75. That was the maximum under baseline. This is during the spirit intention trials. You can see they're slightly larger. When I asked specifically to try to produce a bigger one, the largest one that appeared was 150. And then when I asked him to produce a huge one, look at that. It was really large. So this spirit number 5, was really good at using this technology. And the question is, why was he so good? Again, we'll get back to that in a bit. So how do we address the question of, well, how do we know it's not the mind of the experimenter or the energy of the experimenter? And the answer is very simple. What we have to do is get rid of the experimenter altogether. You see, most of us have cell phones, of course, and as you know, you don't have to be present for your cell phone to pick up the signal, answer the call, record the message, and then you can later download it, right? You're supposed to say yes. Okay? We all know that's how the technology works. We don't have to be present with the phone for it to work. And I reasoned that if this technology was really picking up spirit, and if they were really collaborating and using this equipment, and now that they knew what the experiments were, they could theoretically do these experiments at night when nobody was in the laboratory and follow instructions given by PowerPoint. So we designed the following experiment using even more sophisticated equipment. And these experiments were actually run by an experimenter who was skeptical of all of this, but he was very good at computer programming. We used a camera. It's this one here, this camera is a $40,000 camera. I purchased it on an NIH Center grant for what's called biophoton imaging, which is not important right now. The camera's cooled to minus 77 degrees centigrade. It projects into a completely dark box. It's cooled with this device toward the end over here. It's in a completely black room. Of course, this is completely dark. This is flashed when I took the pictures. And the computer is in a separate dark room. And there was a monitor put up top here, a large monitor, when we were running the PowerPoint experiments. And this is the way the experiment worked. We first did it live, so we made sure that it would work with a human being running the experiment physically. And then once we knew that these spirits could do the experiment, we would then have the experiment run at night. Okay? And there were 2 experiments, subjects that were invited to participate, 2 spirits, and I'll confess who they are in a bit. Do not memorize this diagram. This is the software that was ultimately used to implement it. But the basic paradigm is as follows. And this is based on what we did first live. At 4 o'clock, the experimenter, who was not me, the computer programmer, read a prescribed script, and he'd say, hello, Spirit 1, hello, Spirit 2. We're going to be running an experiment tonight. Please do just like you've done before, doing it with me when I was running it with you, only I won't be there. So please follow the instructions on the PowerPoint. You'll hear my voice, you'll see words and pictures and so on. The experiment will begin at 11 o'clock, so please show up in lab and follow the instructions. Thank you very much, I'm very appreciative, and I'll pick up the data in the morning. He then leaves the laboratory. At 11 o'clock, the computer program starts, the camera is warmed up, had been warmed up before then, an hour before then, and then the computer picks a random number. Might be 12:15, 12:30, 11:30, whatever. The point was that not only was no physical human being present in the laboratory, but we didn't know what time the experiment would actually begin. So let's say it's going to start at 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, the PowerPoint comes on, big monitor, and the voice goes and it says, hello, Spirit 1, I'm so glad you're here. We're going to be starting the experiment, and we're going to be doing it just like we did before. And then it would review. The first 15 minutes is going to be a baseline, so stay with me in the control room. The next 15 minutes, you're going to go into the room next door inside the chamber and let the camera pick up your light. And then after that, you're going to come back here for the last period. And so there'd be a pre-period, then there'd be a spirit intention presence period, and then a post period. It would then actually go through those instructions. When the data collection was over, we'd say thank you very much, then the computer would take a break, and then spirit number 2 would be invited. We did this night after night after night, and the computer determined who came first, spirit 1 or spirit 2. Now, I already knew, based on the prior data, that spirit 2 produced bigger results than spirit number 1. And unbeknownst to the person who was running the experiment, I did not share that information, so I could see whether that would show up even if he was not expecting it. So what did we find? This is a summary of the data. I don't have time to go through the details of how these data are calculated, but it involves looking for structure, because we were looking for potential structure when they were actually sitting in the box, because you've now got a two-dimensional array, and you do what's called two-dimensional fast Fourier analysis, and then what you can do is score the average brightness of those Fourier analyses which correlate with the degree of structure. And the critical thing is, you can see here's the pre-values, the pre-bar, you can't see the light, it's not working, and there's the post, but you can see the one in the middle is clearly larger. But that's not the really interesting part. Oh, this is the replication, but that is very important. Of course, I didn't believe it, so we did the experiment again. By the way, I should also say that you'll see this here. It's the best way to explain this. This is the critical part for this presentation about acknowledging the spirit. You'll notice that these are two-dimensional images colorized from the grayscale using what's called ImageJ software, which is image processing software that you can download for free from NIH. And you can see that this is what the pre looked like, and that's the post. Here's spirit number 1. See, there's the increase in the brightness. Here's spirit number 2. Dramatically larger, spirit number 2, compared to spirit number 1. Been seeing that over and over. It's going to become important. As a further set of controls, we had an equal number of nights, but what we would do is, instead of inviting spirit, we would just have that middle trial be one more baseline. And so here's all the pre's for that night. Well, now it gets dimmer and brighter. There it is. There's the pre's and there's the posts when no spirit was actually invited into the chamber. And there are the blanks if they had been invited. You can see, if anything, they're decreased over time. So you couldn't explain this pattern as due to some sort of cyclical pattern over time. Critical thing is spirit number 2 greater than spirit number 1. We're seeing an individual difference in an energy response. Acknowledging differences in spirit. We also did other studies, just as a sidebar, where we would do distant intentionality studies with people who believed in spirit. And this was a study we did with Healing Touch International. It was at a meeting of one of their annual meetings. There were 245 certified practitioners of Healing Touch, and they did the same kind of experiment, and they invited their spirit helpers to go into the laboratory during the middle trial. And you'll notice how bright this is, the trial in the middle. And these were now lots of spirits apparently going into the room. In order to display how bright this was, we had to dim down the baseline. So you can see this is a very large effect, and this is a way of quantifying those numbers, and you can see what the magnitude is. So, I want to tell you about one more experiment, and then we're going to get back to the critical take-home message. We had the opportunity to replicate this using a different kind of photon detector called a photomultiplier tube. It was at the California Institute of Human Sciences, and they were also doing biophoton imaging. And their photomultiplier tube, which is this device here, They were measuring photons coming off the hands of healers in a pitch black room that was also electromagnetically shielded. There's me looking at this equipment, taking a picture of the camera, and then somebody is obviously taking a picture of me. And that's Dr. Chevalier, who ran this equipment and has been running this laboratory. This is a picture of me closing the door to the chamber. And this is a picture that I took inside the chamber with my phone. It's black because it's black in that room. It is dark. And now here is us outside the laboratory. The data is actually collected on a laptop computer, which is very convenient. And the photon counter per se is just to the left of me. And we then invited, the research medium, invited 8 different spirits to individually go into the chamber. And they were shown how this worked before we actually did this. And we collected only 4 baselines. The reason why we collected only 4 baselines is because this equipment was quite stable, and you could get a good average with just 4. And let me show you what the results were. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Let me show you raw data first. Here is a controlled trial. These are, I think, 1/10 of a second photon counts, if I remember correctly. It may have even been seconds. I'll have to go back and look exactly. The critical thing is that over the course of the trial, which is about 100 and maybe 50 seconds, 40 seconds here, these are the moment changes in photon counts. Remember, this is a completely pitch black environment. And you get these spontaneous changes, and if you say what causes these changes, the answer is nobody knows. It could be changes in the amplifiers, it could be changes in the detector, it could be stray photons. And every now and again, you'll see a burst that would go above 50 counts. All right? And here was a presence of spirit trial. And you'll notice, somebody ask a question? No. You'll notice that that we see an increase in these bursts, which is what we also saw in our previous data. And then it became very easy to simply set a threshold of 50 counts per second and then count the number of bursts that occurred. And when we did that, we got the following results. Here's where the number of bursts above 50 per second in the control trials. There were the presence of spirit trials. And you could see that there was a clearly significant difference. Now, remember, we were outside the room present, so this was not the computer-automated experiment, okay? But we're getting the same effects. However, I want you to remember this graph. Remember how spirit number 2 produced a much brighter Fourier transformation, organization effect, compared to spirit number 1. Well, now we get to something weird. This is the data for spirit number 1. The reason why these numbers are so little is because I had to multiply the x-axis by 10. So instead of this being 0 to 100, it's now 0 to 1,000. So this is 100, and that's 50. So you can see there are just a couple of bursts here. See, there's like 3 bursts. However, for spirit number 2, there's a burst of something like 860 or 70. That value, according to Dr. Gaetan Chevalier, he had never witnessed in 3 years of using this equipment. It was completely anomalous. This was spirit number 2 compared to spirit number 1. Now, when I saw that, I had an aha moment, and I connected the dots. Even more so when I saw this. This is spirit number 3. You can see there's again 0 to 100. There was one peak that was clearly way above 50, and it was 90. That's a large peak by those standards. But this spirit had a single peak of 560 or something like that. Again, clearly anomalous. Spirit 4 and Spirit 2 were very different than the other spirits who were invited. And the question is, what did it mean? So let me explain a little more. And I actually confess this in the Sacred Promise book, but it is assiduously and fastidiously, I don't know how that's the right word, ignored. I mean, it is. What's a word when something is like so badly ignored that nobody ever mentions it to you? Nobody wants to talk to you about it. What? Rejected? Yeah, but it's so greatly denied. It's like, wow. No one has ever spontaneously asked me about this. Nobody. So let me tell you a little bit more about those pictures of 1 and 2. One of the things that happens when you use these super sensitive cameras, that camera, that $40,000 camera I told you about, is the kind of camera that they put on telescopes to see distant galaxies that cannot be seen with the naked eye, that are so weak in intensity that you have to do 15-minute to a half-hour exposures or longer in order to see them. When you have cameras like that, they will occasionally pick up cosmic rays, gamma rays. They will appear like little dots. So if you have the intensity set high enough so you don't see the noise, you don't see the tiny little light that we were searching for, what you do is you see these little dots, and these dots appear over time. And so if you have an exposure of a half hour, for example, you'll have little dots here and there. It's like looking at the stars. Those cosmic rays are thousands of times, tens of thousands of times brighter than the photons that we're picking up to detect spirit. So you have to get rid of them in data analysis if you want to analyze the baseline data. And there are procedures for removing those cosmic rays and replacing them with the average pixel brightness of the normal background. And when I was doing the analyses, the spectral analyses, since you're talking about maybe 20 pixels out of, I don't remember what that was, 100,000 pixels or whatever, the simple thing to do is to just do the Fourier analysis on all of it and just see if there's any structure there. But if you're going to be thorough, what you want to do is to get rid of those cosmic rays and do the Fourier analyses on just the background signal. Or you could do the Fourier analysis on the cosmic rays and ignore the background light. Are you with me so far? Anybody here? You're supposed to say yes. Okay. Anyway, I did that. And here's what I discovered. What I discovered is that the biggest difference between Spirit 1 and Spirit 2 was in the structure of the cosmic rays. That although there were clear effects in the low-level light, I was picking up something extra with Spirit number 2. Spirit number 2 was affecting the highest frequency, cosmic rays. And what were these rays? Well, they were potentially also, quote, cosmic rays. They were certainly much, much higher than the average intensity of the wave. So now we have to confess who is Spirit 3 and who is Spirit 4. Before I do that, I have to tell you who the other spirits were. So let me tell you, first of all, how I would share this with the scientific community. So this is the conservative interpretation. And this is where the coincidence is, the synchronicity, is that I was scheduled to give a talk at the Parapsychological Association meetings this past August. And I was talking about individual differences in photon detection associated with spirit. And I, of course, did not announce what the individual differences in the spirits were. But I was talking about individual differences. And these are the conclusions, and I'm going to read them out loud to you so you can hear a conservative conclusion first, and then I'll give you the deeper interpretation, which is the way that we acknowledge spirit. So here's the conservative. First of all, we have a replication of apparent presence of spirit, POS effects, using a highly sensitive optical detection system, photomultiplier tube, under controlled environmental conditions, pitch black Faraday cage. That was the last experiment, too. We replicate individual differences in apparent positive POS effects. We have 4 separate experiments comparing Spirit 1 versus Spirit 2 across multiple optical detection systems, silicon photomultiplier system, low-light CCD camera system, and photomultiplier tube system. 3, we have a replication of potential type of spirit, hypothesized higher frequency effects. Compare it Spirits 2 and 4 with Spirits 1 and 3. And nobody even asked me about this. It's so amusing. 4, extension to other types of measurements, e.g. radiation bursts and organization of cosmic gamma rays. And 5, the mechanisms of the apparent measurement effects are unknown. That's what we would say in a scientific presentation. But now let's make this personal. Let's bring it back to the foundation of Spiritism, which is where it all began. And I want to preface this by saying, will this work potentially lead us to technology where they can use this equipment to be able to interact with us more objectively and accurately? And if so, by creating this technology, are we potentially giving them a voice? Because remember, most of us can't hear them very clearly, and the subset of us who can, we don't typically hear perfectly. The very best mediums are not as good as their cell phones. I know a lot of gifted mediums. I'm privileged to know them. They're even my friends. When they want to talk to each other or they want to talk to their kids, they don't do it telepathically. They use the phone. It's easier, it's less effortful, it's more accurate, and so on. So, acknowledging the spirit. Well, we are now taking the spirit hypothesis seriously. We are now working with multiple research mediums who are focusing on working with individuals on the other side in the tradition of Mr. Xavier, in the tradition of receiving communication from someone like Andrea Lewis. We're doing it focused on the question of the development of technology and how they can use this technology. And these are various people who are working with us. You probably recognize this guy, right? Anybody recognize this person?
Bohm.
Who?
Bohm.
Yes, it's David Bohm. I will confess, guess who brought this person to the team? Albert brought David to the team. Albert came first. This is Susie Smith. We've already mentioned her. This is Marcia, I confess. Oh, I have to tell you a quick story. I'm going to sidebar for a second. It's the end of the meeting. You guys are tired. Do you remember how I spontaneously confessed that I had this experience with Marcia's husband? This is my mother-in-law, from my father-in-law, whose name is Roger, who I also never met. And I shared that story of the knob on the steering wheel. And I told you that, I don't think about knobs on steering wheels. And then I told you that the day afterwards we went to Tombstone and there was this car, what are these, special built custom cars, with no roof and stuff that have one of those wheels. Well, yesterday I left the meeting early. I'm sorry, but my back was bothering me, and I realized that it was going to be painful, really painful for me to walk back to the hotel, and a taxi cab comes up. And I said, gee, I know you're going in the opposite direction, so on. I said, and it's really not that far, but would you be willing to take me to the hotel? He says, sure. So I get in, and I sit down, and I said, look, I apologize. I'm only going like 4 blocks or whatever, but my back, I have this bad back, and sometimes it goes out. And he says, no problem. He says, I know about having a bad back. He says, I can't even move my legs. And I said, what? And he says, oh, yes. He says, I have a special cab. This is my cab. And I can't use my legs. And so I brake and I use the gas with my hands. I said, really? And then I look over at his steering wheel. I've got a photograph of this. I said, is that a knob on your steering wheel? How many of you have taken a taxi cab and seen a knob on the steering wheel? It's not that common. Is that funny or what? You just have to smile. You have to be thankful. All right. It's Marcia. But anybody know who this person is? Houdini. What? Houdini. Yes, it's Harry Houdini, when Harry Houdini was younger. Harry Houdini is also one of many people. We do not invite these people. We don't object to them, but we don't call on them. They have found their way to my laboratory. And I'm a very conservative scientist, so I insist upon replicated data before I come to the conclusion that any deceased person, whether they're unknown or very well known, is going to be part of the research. Harry Houdini, I call him Harry. In my writing, I refer to him as HHH, which stands for Hypothesized Harry Houdini. He has been with us for at least 5 years. I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours, allegedly, I say allegedly because I don't see and I don't hear, allegedly working with Harry specifically with all of this technology. And Harry is the Harry who is spirit number 5. He's the one, and it's really funny, in the Explore article, where I first talk about this work, the editor, who is actually Dean Radin, when the paper was accepted for publication after it went through the review process, he said, Gary, readers can't keep track of S1, S2, S3. He says, couldn't you give them names? So I said, okay, I'll give them names. So what I did was I used the first names of all the people. Now, of course, nobody knew that Harry was Harry Houdini. If I had said Harry Houdini in the article, it never would have been published. But the truth is, it's Harry. Now think about Harry Houdini. What's interesting about him? Well, a lot of things. Besides the fact that he was bigger than life, besides the fact that he was obviously super famous and so on, there were a couple of things about him that were really special. Number one, he really cared about this field. As many of you may have known, he loved his mother, and after his mother died, he wanted to know whether he could receive communication from his mother. And you'll know that he went, and that was during the craze of physical mediumship, and there was a lot of fraud, real fraud, that was taking place. And he exposed it. Now, he went a little overboard, because there were 1 or 2 genuine mediums that he had a hard time accepting. But he became, part of his fame became in uncovering the fraudulent mediums of the day. And he had developed a deep friendship with, and then deep conflict with, blocking on his name, who authored Sherlock Holmes. What? So Arthur Conan Doyle, right. We refer to him as author. And they were at two different sides of this story. And by the way, Sir Arthur has been involved with this research as well. So if anybody's going to come along and want to say, maybe I got it wrong, it's going to be Harry. Secondly, I don't know if you've seen any specials about Harry Houdini, but he really worked hard. He really practiced. He spent hours and hours and hours and hours. He became king of cards. He was, he put lots of energy and effort into doing the escapes and all the things that he did. So it's not surprising that somebody with his energy and his passion, that he's going to work with this equipment. And he's going to put in the hours and hours and hours of trying to work with this equipment. Thank you. The third thing about him was he was a really loving man. He really cared. And as far as I understand, although he didn't know whether life after death was real, he believed in some sort of a greater spiritual reality. He believed in some sort of divinity. And so having him become part of a team is interesting. And then, of course, politically, imagine if one ever goes public with this. The skeptics love to have these fake seances where for 10 minutes, none of them whom are serious meetings, people get around and they make jokes at the Magic Castle. Harry, please show up and move something. And of course, nothing happens, and then they say, he can't be real. And then there are people that I can't talk about, can't go public with yet. So, for example, one of them we call Peter Taylor. I should tell you, by the way, we have published in journals like the journal, it was then called the Journal for the Academy of Religious and Consciousness Studies or something like that. It's now changed to the Journal of Paranormal and Spiritual Studies or something like that. It is a journal which has been around for years that publishes articles on spirituality, spirit, health, and so on. They have an academy, which was recently renamed. And we've published an article about a reading with Harry Houdini and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That one, I think, was actually published, the one with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was published in a journal which I suspect most of you have read, called the Baker Street Irregulars. How many of you even know what that journal is? Anybody? Turns out it's the official publication of an elite group who are that belong to the Sherlock Holmes Club or something like that. It's only by invitation only, and they have a special journal, and they accepted this. But a journal which talks about Peter Taylor, written with Peter Taylor, so it doesn't disclose his name, was published in that journal, and it talks about the question of spirit and synchronicity. I share this because this work is only possible because people like this care. You can't, it's one thing if we lose a loved one and we want to make contact with that loved one, and then we go to a medium and and maybe we have an hour with that medium and maybe a half hour with our loved one. Some people may have more than one session with the medium. But for most of this work, that's what it's about, and that's what mediums' experiences are. Then there are special people who lose someone close to them, and then they continue to have a relationship with them. Susie Smith was one of them. She developed a relationship with her mother when she eventually became mediumistic, and she ended up having a relationship with her deceased mother for over 40 years. We know in this audience that there is a couple, Dr. and Dr. Petrillo, who had a loss in their family, transformed their lives, and now they're writing books with their son. That relationship is continuing. So sometimes a specific loved one on the other side will be able to have a relationship with a specific person on this side. But how is it that others are going to have longer-term relationships with mediums, particularly if they're trying to help humanity? They're trying to be of service to us. Well, there's no organized way for them to do that right now, unless there are special mediums, like Mr. Xavier. Thank you. And so since we are acknowledging spirit tonight, I want to acknowledge these people because they're part of my inspiration for continuing to do this work. Talk about responsibility. We'll talk about responsibility. When you spend enough time having the privilege of potentially being of service to and assistance with people like this, you then develop a feeling of responsibility to them. They become members of your extended family. And part of the transformation is going to have this being so real someday. If you can imagine the day when we'll have technology, and we're certainly working toward it, where you'll be able to have 3D holographic images of people who have transitioned. I now refer to them as post-physical beings. And you'll be able to see Susie, or you'll be able to see Marcia, or you'll be able to see Harry. And it'll be just at least as real as having 3D Skype. And that we have to envision that possibility. But let me share with you who spirit number 2 and spirit number 4 apparently are. This, I got this off the internet. I have no idea if this is what she ever appears like. Is an angel, hypothesized angel with the name Sophia. Has anyone ever heard of the name Angel Sophia? A few of you may have. Okay. I write about Angel Sophia in the last quarter of the book, The Sacred Promise. So if any of you are interested in this, you can see it disclosed there. I should sidebar and tell you that I was raised to believe that the angel hypothesis was like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. We knew that those were false. Okay? And it's bad enough to mention the S word, as in spirit, with academic colleagues. You want to know the kiss of death? You want to be really ignored? Mention the A word. That's when parapsychologists look the other way. The problem is, what happens if you start getting evidence for the angelic realm? And here's what I've discovered. That all the methods that have been developed over the years for validating the presence of spirit with the aid of mediums, or validating the presence of spirit with the aid of technology, those same scientific methodologies with those same receiving tools can be used to validate the reality of angels. And if I remember yesterday when I asked this group about how many of you believed in the angel hypothesis, the predominance of you raised your hands. Now, if I remember correctly, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Dr. Olivier, but you mentioned something about very high frequency cosmic ray energies in your wave structure. And you even may have used the word angelic at one point in your presentation. I'm not sure. But as I was reading about listening to the possible integration of what we understand about quantum physics and biophysics, coupled with that with the angelic realm. My biggest problem is that the data thus far are consistent with those crazy hypotheses. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting, and I put crazy in quotes, wouldn't it be interesting if science actually someday validated the higher frequency hypothesis with higher realms of ethical and spiritual knowledge, caring, responsibility, and so on? Wouldn't that be fantastic? And it's possible, because if it's real, it's real. So, if I understand it, we are here. Spiritism, in this form, was inspired by this person. Is that fair to say? Okay. And that's why this meeting was convened. And here's what I would love to believe. I would love to believe that he's still with us, that he and people who came after him but have since transitioned, that they are with him, that they are with you, that they are with us. Maybe they're on the stage right now. And that if any group is going to give them a greater voice and is going to give us the opportunity to acknowledge them, give gratitude to them, collaborate with them, learn from them, if any group of people are going to do it, it's going to be, and the bridging of science and spirituality for health, it's going to be this organization. And I consider it a privilege to be able to be a little part of this. And what I would like to do is to thank you and to thank everyone associated with the organization for bringing us together. Thank you. And them, of course.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schwartz.